All right. Thank you, everyone. Can you raise your hand if you were at the dinner last night, the summit dinner? Excellent. Can you keep your hand up if you enjoyed yourself? Even more hands go up. That's great. So some of you enjoyed yourself that were not at the dinner. That's even better. That's great. Well, thank you all, firstly, for your incredible work and staying power, tenacity, engagement. Yesterday, I was talking to a couple of participants this morning that were reiterating to me that this is different from many of the conferences that they go to, both in terms of the level of activity and engagement that they have to put in, but also, very interestingly, from their level of feeling confident and engaged on so many different topics. And that's exactly what the Global Maritime Forum and its partners here are trying to do, is trying to imbue us all with the sense that we truly are in this together. We're going to have just a quick opening now with me. Just a reminder that these plenary sessions are live streamed, so you are on the record, so to speak. We're going to have, after this quick intro, a fantastic discussion with Jane Nelson from the Harvard Kennedy School, seated up here for about 15 minutes or so. But today is all about action. Yesterday was really the sense-making, the big picture, the connections. Today you're going to spend a full 2 hours in action area breakouts. Almost all of you have chosen and signed up using the name tags to one of those 5 action areas. At the end of the discussion with Jane, before we go out to those action areas, if you haven't signed up, please take the opportunity to move your name card over so that we can adjust accordingly. But before any of that, a really important point from me, an update from my mum in Sydney. First of all, she was very, very chuffed to have been mentioned. I also mentioned to her that I had met Saskia from the Port of Rotterdam, and she immediately started looking at flights to the Netherlands. So if anyone would like my mother to come and visit your facility, you just let me know. She'd be delighted to join you. But it reminded me as well of the importance of something that one of our colleagues here at the Global Maritime Forum said to me, our colleague Lau, which relates to what I'm holding in my hand here. Some of you may recognize it. It's a telescope. He was saying that he'd been looking for an opportunity to use this recently because it was a treasured gift that he was given when he finished working with the Danish Maritime Authority. So it was the leaving gift to him before joining the Global Maritime Forum. And naturally, this is the perfect thing to use outside on the deck here, particularly on a bright sunny day. But the telescope, besides being a close connection to the history of the Netherlands, it was Hans Lippenschei who tried to register the first patent of the telescope, a thing for making faraway things seem near, in 1608. It was denied, by the way, and it was Johannes Kepler in Germany that then managed to perfect it and use it for astronomy about 3 or 4 years later, 1610. But this is also a metaphor. It's not just an important tool for navigation, for safety, and for spying on neighbours, whether it's across here in Brooklyn or if you live on the foreshore in the Netherlands. It is a really important metaphor because what we are doing throughout our time at this summit is zooming in and zooming out. We're continually pushing between those two perspectives. Yesterday, we spent quite a lot of time zooming out, pushing our perspective out of our own daily logistical, strategic, tactical challenges and start to think about the big picture. What we're going to do today in the action areas is zoom in. We're not zooming all the way in. We're not talking about specific tasks or logistics, really, within each of the action areas, but we are talking about tactics and strategy that connect us all in terms of talking about short-term action, the policy imperative, green corridors, the need for human sustainability, trade and supply issues. So we're going to go down into strategy and tactics. In our report out, which is going to be a fishbowl format at around midday or so after we finish, or a little bit before. We're going to come back together after our 2 hours of action areas. In the report out, we're going to start at that tactics and strategy and ask each other what we need and relate to one another what matters to make movement, to do justice to the work you're doing today. And then we're going to zoom back out again to finish the day to really think about the cultural aspects, the philosophical aspects, the policy aspects. And when I say policy, I don't just mean government public policy. I mean the rules of the game that we are creating and promulgating by being here together. For all of this, we really need to have a structure and a framework and the inspiration of what has happened before. What has happened before in London, in Singapore, in all the work that you've been doing since the Global Maritime Forum was created, but also connecting to other examples of systems change and system leadership. And it's in that context that I'm delighted to ask Jane Nelson, the director, a director from the Harvard Kennedy School in Corporate Responsibility. Jane, come and please take a seat. And we're just going to have a short discussion about systems leadership, systems change, and really get us ready for that zooming in, using the telescope to come into these action areas and make a difference. So Jane, thank you very much for being with us. One more piece of introduction. When I asked Jane, and this is always the case with incredibly accomplished people, the biography is 3 pages of engagement and success and just interesting, influential work with so many different groups. And I said to Jane, well, how do I present that to an audience like this biography? And Jane said, very humbly, I might add, she said, I think the most important thing is I've been involved in sustainability efforts in building coalitions since the Rio summit. So thank you so much for being here, Jane, because we're drawing here on the theoretical frameworks, the research and the work that comes from being at an institution like Harvard, but also your deep experience looking across so many of these coalition and change-making efforts. So let's start maybe with your sense of what stories of success should we be taking inspiration from in other areas and here in previous iterations of our work in order to feel like we've got a chance of reaching that ambitious, terribly ambitious goal that we outlined yesterday.
Great. No, well, thanks very much, Nick, and good morning, everyone. It's just fantastic to be here amongst what I would argue is already one of the emerging stories of success in sort of global systems leadership. As I sort of look around the room at this remarkable group of leaders and sort of change makers that are the Global Maritime Forum, I think this is absolutely systems leadership, in action. And if we think about the industries that have been most important in driving economic growth and human progress in history, and that are going to be absolutely non-negotiably crucial in driving more inclusive and equitable and sustainable economic growth going forward, pretty much most of those industries are represented in this room and in the Global Maritime Forum. So think food and food commodities, mining and metals, energy, essential consumer products and the producers of essential consumer products, financial services, particularly banking and insurance, physical infrastructure and construction and logistics, the digital platform organizations and sort of data organizations, and then of course the shipping and both the ship owners, the charterers, the shipping associations that, to me are that conduit between, and a crucial conduit between production and prosperity. And then if you add to that as part of the Global Maritime Forum, you've got trade union organizations, seafarers, social support organizations, you've got environmental groups who are here as partners and challengers and coordinators. You've got the basis, I think, and already demonstrating it, of being able to address, across the river this week, Antonio Guterres has talked about the greatest cascade of crises in our lifetimes. And so to me today is about, what's the greatest cascade of solutions in our lifetimes, and the basis of the solutions is very much here. So what are some other examples in other sectors? I think, to me, in terms of driving systems change, there's sort of three types of collective action that I think are crucially important, and all of them you've already started on, both individually and collectively. And the first is developing and spreading global norms and standards and rules of the game, both for sort of, ethical, responsible conduct, but also obviously for environmental and sort of, human rights responsible conduct. And one example that I would highlight on the climate front that I think has been a very excellent example of systems change in recent years is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And I think a great example of, just over a decade ago, two, admittedly very influential individuals, Mark Carney and Mike Bloomberg, said after the global financial crisis, well, why don't we look at systemic shocks, from a climate perspective? Why don't we set up a task force to see what we can do to make sure we improve monitoring and disclosure on climate risk and financial-related climate risk? And they were incredibly strategic, set up a task force, set a clear mission that was going to be about understanding those risks. They identified who are the key stakeholders, both from an institutional investor perspective, some of the key regulators, some of the key companies that are major emitters, and built this coalition through doing consultations around the world. Once they got a framework, that framework could have just been another report that could have sat on a shelf somewhere. And they and the task force were really intentional about, okay, who in the institutional investor community do we need to get on board? BlackRock, Vanguard, the big players. Let's get focused, get them on board. Who are the companies and the hard-to-abate sectors? How can we find 2 or 3 individual CEOs, but as well as companies in those hard-to-abate sectors that will come on board? Which are the associations we can get on board? And through that sort of process of coalition, they had a framework, they had a goal and a vision, they built that stakeholder network, and then obviously we're now at a stage where there's hundreds of thousands of companies are using the framework on a voluntary basis, but now the EU, the SEC, and others are beginning to embed it from a regulatory perspective. And I think we see a lot of examples like that around the rules of the game for more ethical, safe, and responsible business. And obviously, a number of your principles are examples, and we'll come back to that. I think the sort of second, very quickly, sort of key area of sort of systems change and collective leadership that's been really important is mobilizing and catalyzing large-scale collective investment and innovation around a particular objective. And obviously, every single one of your companies, I mean, every NGO in the room here today is mobilizing certainly investment and funding and innovation. You all have your own R&D, but examples of coalitions to actually bring that all together in a way where the sum's greater than the parts and you can mobilize it at scale. And I think we've seen a lot of great examples in the global health sector, and things like the Global Fund, which is just doing a replenishment this week here, which has saved 50 million lives by bringing together governments, pharmaceutical companies, but also some of the companies in this room, Anglo-American, Chevron, who sort of stepped up and said HIV, AIDS, TB, and malaria are challenges to our industry, and partnered with pharmaceutical companies who they normally wouldn't have anything to do with, as well as governments, as well as philanthropic foundations, and have to date saved something like 50 million lives. And I think another great example on sort of joint mobilization of innovation and investment, which I know some of you are involved with, is the First Movers Coalition. And actually sort of saying, okay, who are the largest purchasers of energy in the world? If we can identify those largest purchasers of energy, and how can they work with some of the hard-to-abate sectors, and by doing collective purchasing, collective action, they can move the agenda forward, in addition to continuing to set their own individual goals and targets. And then the third, so there's sort of that developing and spreading the rules of the game, the global norms and standards on a voluntary basis before it becomes regulation, on an industry-wide basis. Secondly, that sort of mobilizing large-scale investment and innovation. And then thirdly, I think an area of opportunity for you is on the policy, sort of innovative policy dialogue. And yes, we're all the trade associations and the shipping associations are going to continue to do lobbying, and that's fine. But are there sort of opportunities for progressive policy advocacy coalitions? And an example I'd use there, which again some of you have been involved with, is the We Mean Business Coalition. You know, the Copenhagen climate talks were a bit of a disaster. They didn't move the agenda forward. Leading into Paris, a group of 7 sort of business leadership groups. So they weren't, they weren't sort of trade associations, but they were leadership groups like the Global Maritime Forum. Said, why don't we get together? You know, they had collectively hundreds of members, but they were sort of at the leadership level. And so 7 sort of leadership groups got together and developed a set of, they had like 5 very practical asks of government, and they had sort of commitments that they would make collectively. And they played a crucial role and they, you know, at the global level, but also at the national level of the national delegations. They made sure they had business leaders on the national delegations, and they had this, you know, very coordinated sort of business-led advocacy agenda saying this is what we expect from governments, but here's what we commit to as businesses. So, you know, sort of a new way of policy engagement and dialogue that you know, Christina Figueres and others would argue was absolutely crucial in the result of the Paris Agreement.
Thank you so much, Jane. And you can see me furiously taking notes because this is gold. If you don't get a chance to spend time at the Harvard Kennedy School doing some of the courses and the work at the Corporate Responsibility Initiative, I think that's 3, first of all, great examples that spreading global norms and standards that start voluntarily but then get adopted and move in to the regulatory space. The large-scale collaborative investment in innovation and R&D, it's so relevant to so many of the pieces of work that we're going to be doing here. And then that policy dialogue, and in particular your point there about different coalitions coming together with the same ask at the global national level, focusing on those critical topics. So thank you for that. So building on all of that, what should we be doing here today and across with the Global Maritime Forum? And from what you've seen, you were here for part of yesterday afternoon, which is fantastic, and you saw that final piece on our principles, etc. We'll show that slide on the principles before we move into action areas. But where should we be focusing?
Yeah, I think in all 3 of those areas, and as I said at the outset, Global Maritime Forum and the organisations in this room are already taking, I think, incredible action on all 3 of those. So my sort of call to action would be, first of all, first and foremost, double down on the various principal platforms that you have. So the Poseidon principles, both on the banking and the insurance, the sea cargo charter, the Neptune Declaration I'll come to just now, but not part of Global Maritime Forum, but the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network. You've got some fantastic collective action, sort of rules-making, norm-setting coalitions already. Most of them are at the level of principles, which is where you have to start, and it's like, okay, what are the principles, what are we aiming to? I guess my encouragement would be, how do you make them even more robust and accountable in terms of performance and delivery? And I think an interesting example here, and I know we have some mining companies in the room, is the International Council of Mining and Metals, which I would say ICMM is the equivalent in the mining sector to the Global Maritime Forum. It's a leadership group, leading CEOs, leading associations. They had 10 sustainable development principles for over a decade, and they're great, and they're the North Star, the vision. But they were saying, okay, how do we, and everyone has to sign up to them, but then they said, okay, how do we take to the next stage? And what they've done is they've set performance expectations, so voluntary performance expectations for those principles. And again, I think with the Poseidon principles, that's already beginning to fit into place, but how does one make sure that the principles you have do have that sort of extra level of performance expectations, transparency and accountability? I think also on the principles, I was so impressed everything I've learned about the Neptune Declaration in terms of responding to a particular crisis at a particular time in terms of the crew change crisis at the time of COVID-19. I think there's a real opportunity, because it seems the one bit that's missing, I know you've got a new initiative on diversity, equity and inclusion, but is there the possibility to sort of further advance the Neptune Declaration, drawing on probably the UN guiding principles on business and human rights and saying, how does one have a declaration that is about the lives and the safety, the livelihoods, and the learning of seafarers and other vulnerable communities in our value chain? And so, the Neptune Declaration and the action that was taken was responding to the most vulnerable people at a time of crisis. Could that be expanded as a network going forward with performance expectations? I think on the second sort of category of large-scale investment and innovation, getting to net zero. Again, I know we're just in the beginning, but it's a fantastic example, and I would argue it's probably going to become one of the most important examples going forward. And within that, the green corridors. I think the more and more sort of place-based or corridor-based initiatives, the better. So again, I think the framework's there, and enormous potential on the decarbonisation side, notwithstanding all the incredible challenges. One other area that I would encourage you to think about is, we've got the Global Maritime Forum. Is there the potential for a Global Maritime Fund? And I know there's a lot of debate, certain members of the ecosystem that don't pay taxes, or that there are going to be taxes, but at this particular time, and I know that the International Chamber of Shipping is talking about a fund for R&D, but is there a possibility of setting up a fund with all the different stakeholders in the Global Maritime Forum, which could be focused on, one of the gentlemen sort of said yesterday, training and capacity building in Africa. It could be focused on, the shipping and maritime industry supporting humanitarian assistance programs at a time where we're tragically going to need a lot of support from this industry and others on humanitarian assistance. Could it be around a blue economy, sort of oceans agenda? But I think the potential for this group to think of a sort of innovative, sort of sustainable development fund almost, which is around building both people's capacity and environmental impact would be interesting. And then finally, on the policy advocacy, an idea that I think might be worth thinking about in the policy imperative group is, this group has a voice. You're obviously, IMO and the trade associations within the maritime sector you're engaged with, but is there a possibility for the Global Maritime Forum to work with, the International Council of Mining and Metals, and IPECA, which is the energy industry, or the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative on the energy side, the Consumer Goods Forum on the food side, so that, again, the components that are part of Global Maritime Forum, including the shipping, but also some of the other industry sectors, which, again, are not the trade associations, they're the leadership groups in those industry sectors. Could there be a joint sort of a commitment on one or two policy asks of governments as we move forward?
It's really fantastic, and I think it brings the sense of optimism to me that what you all are working on and what you have been working on for a number of years is exactly in the right direction, in the best tradition of systems leadership, the frontier of what we know works, but also that there's all this possibility. We don't have to feel stuck because it's hard to have these conversations. There's huge opportunity to make different, better connections. And I just note there that Jane's comments, you linked to human sustainability. So we talk there about seafarers, etc. You picked up on Fleming's idea there about training in Africa and the idea of the fund that links back to that. I also reflect on the fact that a couple of things I heard yesterday about the idea of shipping and global trade being a global public good, being reframed in a public good sense, which has obviously some commercial implications for us all, but importantly raises this idea of equity and collaborative investment in the system of freedom of navigation, freedom of trade, and access to ports and shipping facilities, etc. So I think I feel really encouraged that we're going in the right direction. One thing that I do see, and this is the case for me, and I'm sure for many of you, is I often finish these conferences and relatively quickly forget what I personally need to be doing until I get an email from Johanna or Casper or the team members saying, please, can you do X, Y, Z? Because we're going to be subsumed into the emails of Monday morning. So how can we as leaders, and how can our audience as leaders in this area, what's the investment in collaborative leadership that allows us to continually be putting energy into these roles. What have you seen works in your leadership programs with leaders around the world?
Yeah. I think sort of three things I would highlight, and they're all actually really obvious, and I think they're about good leadership generally. And a good colleague of mine sort of describes sort of systems leadership as sort of imperfect solutions to impossible problems, and so that point of just getting on and doing it, we just can't wait. And I think sort of three areas that each of us can do individually. One is sort of understanding our stakeholders, and I think we do it implicitly. I'm not sure we're intentional enough. And both our internal stakeholders, so many of us are in organizations where even if we're the CEO, sometimes the board is pushing back, and if one's further down the hierarchy, one has to do a lot of influencing to take particularly a progressive non-business as usual agenda forward. So sort of understanding the key stakeholders, whether it's in your internal system or that broader ecosystem that one's got to engage with. And someone said yesterday, and I resonate so strongly, that listen to different stakeholders. Obviously, the more diverse the stakeholders are, both internally but also externally, the more likelihood one's going to have, fresh ideas and new perspectives. Youth, I just don't think we do a good enough job. We talk about the war for talent and talent development, but sort of engaging with youth leaders actually in a structured way, either individually as mentors or as our companies and organizations, and also sort of vulnerable stakeholders. Actually thinking of every major investment and new ship that's built or new charter. Who are the vulnerable stakeholders? And that's obviously seafarers, but who are the other vulnerable stakeholders that we should be understanding and hearing from and listening to? So that's sort of understanding your internal and external stakeholders, sort of mapping and then being very intentional about listening and learning to them, I think is one key element. The second one is sort of, and again, just basic leadership, understanding your levers. What are the levers, and the mechanisms that one can leverage to get change to happen? And at the end of the day, it's inspiring people. There's cultural levers and behavior change levers, but it's finance, and both internally and externally. And again, being much more creative. What are the blended finance opportunities between governments, foundations, institutional investors, companies that can move this agenda forward? The data and the information that we need, and being really intentional. What are the key gaps in data and information? Obviously, the sort of technologies and technology pathways, being really intentional, thinking about that. And then the policy change. What policy changes does one need to shift internally, as well as what policy shifts should we be looking at externally? And so sort of understanding those levers and then co-creating, again, either with a group internally or as part of a broader systems level, which are the 4 or 5 levers that we're going to focus on and really try and move the agenda forward. So it's that, sort of that understanding and co-creating with stakeholders, the understanding of the levers, and then thirdly, that sort of, I guess, element of understanding ourselves and our resilience and our core group of supporters, because this change, being a groundbreaker and a change maker and doing things differently in established institutions or creating brand new institutions is often lonely work. It's difficult work. There's personal risks. There's often personal reputation risks one has to take. And so that sort of, someone talked yesterday about being brave. I mean, that courage, that resilience. And I think, we get courage from inside of our purpose, and our passion is strong. But we draw the courage and resilience from that core group of colleagues, either within our own organizations or externally, who that support network. And to me, that's sort of one of the core elements of systems leadership. So the stakeholder listening and engagement, that sort of, understanding and leveraging those levers, and then that personal, and having a plan for all of those. And
having a plan. And what I'm taking away from this, which is fantastic, is that as you all know, the work of this summit, your work here with the Global Maritime Forum, both fortunately and unfortunately doesn't end when we finish lunch this afternoon. And I guess what I'm taking away from your point there, Jane, is we need to replicate a lot of the way we interact here, catalyzed by all the fantastic structures and networks set up and shepherded by the Global Maritime Forum. We need to replicate that in our own organizations, in our own networks, in our own sub-sectors and areas of engagement, including in building some of the culture of this inside our organization. Any final comments on that idea of how we demonstrate this kind of culture of leadership and representing these principles, which I'll ask the team to throw up on the screen now, Stu, if you can. As we think about representing those principles that we finished with yesterday in culture, any comments on that act of leadership?
Yeah, I mean, other than having obviously the courage to act, but and again, it's leadership in general. I think who are the 3 or 4 champions in your organization, and obviously preferably the more senior they are, and again, if you're the CEO, who are the board directors, who are going to be, what's that core coalition internally that's going to be speaking out, not just on modeling those principles, but saying, the net zero commitment being the classic example. We won't get there unless we're living to those principles. So and then embedding it in board discussions and having board committees, and many of the companies here do have board committees that are safety and sustainability committees, so that at the board level these are discussed every single board meeting. They're not just a sort of a tick the box on the side. They're part of incentives. They're part of training, they're part of safety shares, value shares. So you're sort of embedding them in the day-to-day, both strategy and business planning and operations of the company. I think the only way we move forward, and many of the companies in the room are beginning to do that. So it's not a sort of a sustainability team off on the side. It's a strategy that is, to meet short-term imperatives and crisis management, but also to create long-term value by being more inclusive and diverse and equitable and respecting human rights and addressing environmental issues, particularly net zero. So it's how one embeds those, making public goals and public commitments, and then embedding them in the key operations of the company, I think is where one goes. And it's often a tiny group of people that get that going in a lot of companies.
This is fantastic. 2 amazing things that I've taken away from this session. I hope you have too. First of all, a sense of organization, a sense of optimism, and a sense that we're on the right track and we have this headroom to move, and even despite the ambition levels. But second, a sense of structure here, an opportunity to think through very clearly in the terms of the principles, that these are your principles, only slightly reworded. We haven't done kind of one of these dodgy facilitator things where we've taken your words and changed it around to fit a predetermined agenda. These are pretty much what we read out at the closing session yesterday. But it's then turning that into, very practically, into let's, in a structured way, understand stakeholders, let's look at our levers, and then let's think about how our own behavior can model that. And I just want to finish on a note, again, of pragmatism. This isn't that easy, nor does it come naturally to most of us, because we are specialized and have specific skills and styles and relationships in one area. So please don't hesitate to ask for help in terms of working together, in seeking the kind of structure and support around this, because no one in this room should feel stuck because they think, I'm not so sure about how to facilitate that hard discussion, or I'm not sure where the data is to convince my finance team that this is a worthwhile investment. I guarantee those skills, that data, that engagement, those relationships, the unlock into the network exists within this room and in the broader community if we work together to find it. And that's really what systems leadership is about, right? It's spreading this and making, as you said, Jane, more out of the sum of the parts. So the whole is more than just the sum of our own individual capacities, relationships. So everyone, can we thank Dr. Jane Nelson? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think also, the Global Maritime Forum has the platforms already, so it's making those platforms work.